Welcome. I am Dr. Watson, your companion tonight. Settle beside the fading fire as we leave Baker Street for Surrey, where shadows mood beneath peaceful trees. Tonight's tale is the Reigate Puzzle, a mystery of gunfire, deception, and deadly secrets. There are adventures of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, which the public remembers for their excitement, and others which remain hidden behind matters too delicate for easy discussion. The events surrounding certain continental intrigues of the spring of 1887 belong to that latter class. They demanded from Holmes a degree of exertion that even his extraordinary constitution could scarcely endure. It was during those weary weeks that I received a telegram from France. I remember the morning distinctly. Rain tapped softly against the windows of my practice when the message arrived. Holmes, it said, lay ill at the Hôtel du Long in Lyons. Within a day I was at his bedside. I confess now with some shame that dread accompanied me throughout the journey. Those who knew Sherlock Holmes only by reputation imagined him fashioned of iron and intellect alone, immune to the frailties of ordinary men. Yet I had seen too much of his private struggles to entertain such illusions. When at last I entered his room in Lyons, relief washed over me. He was pale, terribly thin, but not dying. The strain, rather than disease, had overthrown him. For 2 months he had labored without restraint, pursuing his investigation with an almost merciless intensity. 15-hour days had become routine. More than once he admitted to having worked continuously for nearly 5 days, sustained only by determination and the fierce excitement of pursuit. Even victory, when it came, had offered him little comfort. Europe rang with praise of his success, and telegrams crowded his chamber by the dozen. Yet I found him sunk in a melancholy deeper than any physical weakness. His violin lay unopened. His keen eyes, usually alive with restless fire, stared instead toward the shuttered window. There are moments when genius burns too fiercely for its own vessel. This, I feared, was one of them. 3 days later, we returned together to Baker Street. Spring had begun its slow awakening over London, yet the city seemed to press upon Holmes rather than restore him. Though his strength improved, I saw plainly that the atmosphere of cases, correspondence, and constant interruption threatened to undo all progress. It was then that I proposed the country. My old companion, Colonel Hayter, whom I had attended during our Afghan days, possessed a comfortable bachelor residence near Reigate in Surrey. He had long urged me to visit, and had more than once insisted that my remarkable friend should accompany me. The suggestion required diplomacy. Holmes detested social obligations. Yet, when I explained that Hayter's establishment was entirely masculine, free from ceremony, and generous in allowing privacy, I observed a faint glimmer of interest. "A bachelor household, Watson," said he, from the sofa. "Entirely. No ambitious daughters? None. No musical evenings? I give you my solemn word," He considered this. At worst, said he, the countryside may prove less exhausting than London, and thus, scarcely a week after our return from France, we found ourselves beneath Colonel Hayter's roof in Surrey. Hayter himself proved precisely the companion I had hoped. Seasoned soldier with weathered features, a steelfast practicality, he possessed the rare gift of treating Holmes neither as curiosity nor celebrity. Their acquaintance prospered immediately, founded upon mutual appreciation of firearms, foreign campaigns, and unusual experiences. The evening of our arrival remains clear in my memory. Dinner had ended. Outside, the countryside rested beneath the mild spring darkness, while indoors we sat comfortably within the Colonel's gun-room. Holmes reclined upon the sofa, appearing more relaxed than I had seen him in many weeks. Hayter and I examined his collection of Eastern weapons, curved daggers from India, Afghan ghazals, and pistols gathered during forgotten campaigns. The room glowed with firelight and tobacco smoke. Then, quite suddenly, the Colonel spoke. "By the way," said he, lifting a pistol thoughtfully from its rack, "I think I shall take one of these upstairs tonight." I looked up. "An alarm?" I asked. Hayter nodded. "Yes, we have had something of a disturbance in this district lately," and with those quiet words began the strange affair known to me as the Reigate Puzzle. The Colonel's words lingered for a moment in the warm stillness of the gun-room. Outside, the Surrey night stretched quiet and dark beyond the windows, while within, the glow of the hearth painted the polished barrels and curved steel of Hayter's collection with soft reflections. Holmes remained stretched upon the sofa, though his long illness still clung faintly to him. I noticed a familiar alertness stirring behind his languid pose. "An alarm?" I repeated. "Yes," said Colonel Hayter. "A small disturbance, perhaps, but enough to keep a man thoughtful." He balanced the pistol in his hand, before setting it carefully aside. "Old Acton's place was broken into last Monday." Holmes turned his head slightly. I recognized the motion. It was the smallest indication of interest, but with Sherlock Holmes such movements mattered. "No great damage done," Hayter continued. "So the fellows remain uncaught. No clue?" Holmes asked lazily. The Colonel shook his head. "None that amounts to anything. It appears to be one of our little country crimes, Mr. Holmes, hardly worthy of Baker Street after your continental triumphs." Holmes dismissed the compliment with a faint movement of his fingers, though I saw the ghost of amusement pass across his features. "Was there anything unusual?" "Not particularly. The library was ransacked, drawers emptied, cabinets forced. Yet the thieves carried off almost nothing." "What did they take?" I asked. The Colonel frowned as he recalled the list. Rather absurd collection, if truth be told. A volume of Pope's Homer, 2 plated candlesticks, an ivory paperweight, a small oak barometer, and ball of string." I laughed softly. "What an extraordinary assortment!" "Precisely," said Hayter. "The rogues seemed to have grabbed whatever lay nearest." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Holmes gave a low grunt from the sofa. "The county police should make something of that," said he. I raised a warning finger immediately. "You are here to recover," I told him. For once, Holmes, I insist upon it. No investigations. No theories. Heaven preserve us from another international conspiracy. He glanced toward Hayter with comic resignation. You hear my gala, Colonel, and a sensible gala, too, said Hayter. Holmes sighed theatrically and closed his eyes. Yet I knew my friend too well. The subject had touched him, even then, even while pretending indifference. The conversation drifted elsewhere, to Afghanistan, cavalry charges, and certain unpleasant frontier memories best softened by distance and tobacco smoke. But beneath it all I sensed Holmes thinking. That peculiar list of stolen objects had lodged somewhere within his mind. It was destined, however, that my attempts at preserving his rest should prove entirely futile. Morning came bright. The Surrey countryside possessed a freshness that London never knew. Dew silvered the lawns, and sunlight spilled through the breakfast-room windows as we sat at table. I had just begun to think the peaceful atmosphere might truly restore Holmes when the door burst open. Hayter's butler entered in such agitation as his usual dignity had deserted him entirely. "Have you heard the news, sir?" he gasped. The colonel lowered his coffee cup. "At the Cunningham, sir? Another burglary?" Hayter asked. The servant swallowed. "Murder, sir?" For a moment the room fell silent. "Murder," repeated the colonel. "Yes, sir. William, the coachman, shot through the heart." Hayter let out a low whistle. "Good heavens! One of the family?" "No, sir. William Kirwan. The burglar escaped." The butler spoke rapidly now, still pale from shock. Apparently the intruder had forced entry near midnight. William, faithful to his duties, and alarmed by the recent robbery nearby, had confronted the fellow and paid for his courage with his life. "When?" Hayter asked. "About 12 o'clock, sir." The colonel nodded gravely. "We shall go over later." After the man withdrew, he stirred his coffee with unusual seriousness. "It is a bad business," said he. "Old Cunningham is our leading magistrate here, and a decent fellow. William had served him for years." Holmes, who had thus far said nothing, looked thoughtfully toward the window. "The same men as the Acton affair?" he asked. "So it appears." Holmes folded his hands. "Curious." Hayter looked at him. "Curious." "Yes." Holmes spoke slowly. "A gang of burglars operating in the country generally avoids repetition. One robbery in a district invites vigilance. 2 within days, in neighbouring houses." He shook his head faintly. "It is hardly the behaviour of cautious criminals. Local men, perhaps," said the colonel. "Acton and Cunningham are the largest houses nearby, and the wealthiest." Hayter smiled dryly. "They ought to be, though a lawsuit has drained both families for years. Acton claims rights over part of the Cunningham estate, and the lawyers have feasted accordingly." At this, Holmes opened his eyes fully. I saw it then. That unmistakable light, the hunter's light. "If local," said he, "the fellow should not prove difficult to find." I groaned. "All right, Watson," he said, for I could protest. "I do not intend to meddle." At that precise moment, the butler returned. "Inspector Forrester, sir." The visitor who entered was a young police officer with keen features and quick eyes. "Good morning, Colonel," said he. "I hope I do not intrude, but we were informed that Mr. Sherlock Holmes is staying here." Hayter gestured toward the sofa. The inspector bowed respectfully. "We wondered, sir." whether you might care to see the matter. Holmes smiled faintly. The fates conspire against my physician. I folded my arms. They usually do. The inspector remained standing. We have no clue in the Acton case, said he. But here matters are different. The man was seen. Holmes sat upright. Indeed, yes, sir. Mr. Cunningham and his son both witnessed the fellow escaping. And as the young inspector began describing the strange midnight shooting at Cunningham Hall, I felt, with quiet resignation, that our peaceful holiday in Surrey had already come to an end. Inspector Forrester drew nearer to the breakfast table, and as he did so, I observed Holmes settling into that peculiar stillness which always marked the awakening of his faculties. The languor of illness seemed, for the moment at least, forgotten. "We have something to work upon this time," said the inspector. The murderer was seen. Holmes steepled his fingers. "Pray continue." The young officer spoke clearly and with evident confidence. Mr. Cunningham and his son, Mr. Alec Cunningham, were both awake when the affair occurred. The alarm broke out at about 11:45. Old Mr. Cunningham had only just retired, while the son remained awake, smoking in his dressing room. Holmes nodded slightly. And the dead man? William Conan, the coachman. He lived with his mother at the lodge, and was known as a steady and faithful servant. The inspector continued. According to the account already gathered, William had apparently gone up toward the house after noticing suspicious activity. Whether prompted by caution or duty, none could yet say. At the rear of the Cunningham residence, near the kitchen entrance, he encountered an intruder. A struggle followed. Young Alec Cunningham, hearing cries for help, rushed downstairs. The back door stood open. Outside, he saw two men wrestling. Then came a shot. One figure collapsed. The other fled across the garden, vaulted the hedge, and vanished into the darkness. Meanwhile, Mr. Cunningham, looking from his bedroom window, observed the fugitive reaching the road before losing sight of him entirely. Alec, instead of pursuing, remained with the dying servant. That, concluded the inspector, is the story as we presently understand it. Holmes had listened without interruption. Description of the man? Middle height, said Forrester. Dressed in dark clothing. Unfortunately, little more than that. A stranger. We believe so, but inquiries are already underway. If he is unknown in the district, we shall soon hear of him. Holmes said nothing. He merely stared down at the breakfast cloth, his expression unreadable. Did Conan speak before he died? I asked. Not a word. And his mother? The inspector shook his head. She is elderly, deaf, and greatly shaken. We can obtain nothing reliable from her. A brief silence followed. Then Forrester reached into his notebook. There is, however, one particularly important circumstance. He unfolded a small scrap of torn paper and laid it carefully upon the table. This was found between the dead man's finger and thumb. Holmes leaned forward instantly. I watched his eyes sharpen. The fragment was small and ragged, clearly torn from a larger sheet. The inspector pointed toward the writing. You will observe the hour mentioned. It corresponds precisely with the time of the murder. It may represent an appointment. Holmes took the paper delicately, I moved nearer. Only a few words remained visible. At 11:45. Learn what may. The fragment appeared insignificant enough, and yet I sensed at once that it exerted a remarkable effect upon Holmes. He examined it with extraordinary concentration. "Interesting," said he quietly. The inspector continued. "One possible theory is that Kirwan may not have been entirely innocent. Though he possessed a good reputation, he could conceivably have been in league with the burglar. Perhaps he met the fellow intentionally, helped him gain entry, and afterward quarrelled with him." Holmes remained absorbed in the paper. Then, at length, he spoke. "This writing is of very great interest." The inspector smiled modestly, plainly gratified. "These waters," Holmes continued, "are deeper than they appear." And to my astonishment, he sank back in his chair, elbows on knees and fingertips pressed together, staring at the fragment as though the fate of empires depended upon its markings. Several long minutes passed. No one interrupted. The breakfast room, so lively moments before, had become strangely still. Outside, birds moved through the garden hedges. Within, Sherlock Holmes seemed to retreat to some private chamber of thought, inaccessible to ordinary men. Then, suddenly, he looked up. I confess, I started. His pale cheeks carried a faint flush of colour, and his eyes, dull only yesterday, burned once more with their familiar brilliance. He rose so abruptly that his chair scraped the floor. "I shall tell you what," said he. "I should like to examine this matter personally." I groaned inwardly. Holmes smiled. "The game, Watson, appears to insist upon us." The inspector brightened. "You will come, then, if Colonel Hayter permits me to abuse his hospitality." "Most certainly," said Hayter warmly. Holmes turned to me. "You and the Colonel may remain at leisure if you prefer. I merely wish to test one or two small ideas." I knew that tone. There was no stopping him. Thus, Holmes departed with Inspector Forrester, leaving us at breakfast. An hour passed, then another. I spent much of it in conversation with Hayter regarding local affairs, yet my thoughts wandered continually toward Holmes. There is a peculiar anxiety attached to watching him work after illness. One admires the power of his mind, and yet fears the strain it imposes. At length the inspector returned. "Alone. Where is Holmes?" I asked immediately. "Walking in the fields," said he. His expression puzzled me. "He requests that we all accompany him to Cunningham Hall." "To the scene?" said Hayter. "Yes." The Colonel rose at once. "And what does he make of it?" The inspector hesitated. "Well," he lowered his voice slightly, "between ourselves, gentlemen, I am not entirely certain that Mr. Holmes has fully recovered his strength." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He has behaved rather unusually." The young officer shifted awkwardly. "Very excited, odd, even." I smiled, despite myself. "You have not worked with him before?" The inspector shrugged. "Some might call it brilliance. Others?" He paused delicately. "Something nearer madness." I laughed softly. "There is method in his madness." "Perhaps," muttered Forrester, "though at present I cannot see it." And so, beneath a bright Surrey sky, and with growing curiosity regarding my friend's strange conduct, we set out together toward Cunningham Hall, unaware that Holmes had already begun to glimpse the truth hidden beneath the quiet countryside. We found Sherlock Holmes pacing slowly along the edge of a meadow, not far from Cunningham Hall. The morning sun rested warmly upon the Surrey fields, and a gentle breeze stirred the hedgerows. Yet Holmes appeared almost unconscious of his surroundings. His chin was sunk upon his breast. His hands were thrust deep into his pockets. He walked with long, measured strides, wholly absorbed in thought. When he perceived us approaching, he halted and smiled faintly. "The affair grows in interest," said he. "Watson, your proposed holiday has proved unexpectedly fruitful." The inspector gave him a searching look. "You have discovered something, then?" "Several things," Holmes replied. "Whether they amount to anything remains to be seen." Colonel Hayter laughed. "You look considerably more alive than you did yesterday, my dear Colonel. Intellectual exercise is sometimes more restorative than sleep." I observed him carefully. Though his face still carried traces of recent illness, the old alertness had undeniably returned. "You have already visited the scene?" asked Hayter. "Yes. Inspector Forrester and I have made a modest reconnaissance. And the result?" Holmes smiled slightly. "A conviction that the matter is very singular indeed." We began walking toward the Cunningham property together. As was his custom, Holmes spoke while moving, arranging his observations aloud. "First," said he, "we viewed the body of the unfortunate William Kirwan." The inspector nodded gravely. "He was certainly killed by a revolver shot." "I thought as much," said Holmes. Hayter looked surprised. "You doubted it?" "My dear Colonel, one doubts everything until it is verified." He spoke lightly, yet I knew he meant a principle with complete seriousness. "Our inspection was not wasted," Holmes continued. "We then interviewed both Mr. Cunningham and his son, who pointed out the precise location where the supposed murderer escaped through the hedge." "And?" asked the inspector. "And that proved interesting." Holmes offered no explanation. It was one of his habits, most vexing at times, to advance conclusions only when he deemed the moment suitable. "We also visited William Kirwan's mother," he said, "but she could tell us nothing." The inspector sighed. "She is quite overcome." Holmes nodded. "Indeed." We had, by now, reached the long avenue leading toward Cunningham Hall. The house stood ahead among trees, an imposing Queen Anne residence of considerable dignity, its red brick walls softened by age and climbing ivy. Before reaching it, Holmes resumed. "There is one circumstance," said he, "which dominates all others." "The note?" I asked. "Precisely, Watson." His hand brushed his coat pocket, where I presumed the torn fragment remained. The dead man held it at the moment of death. It bore the exact hour of the meeting. Surely we must ask ourselves, what became of the remainder? The inspector answered at once. "I searched carefully for it." "Quite so," said Holmes. "But consider, why was the paper torn at all?" No one replied. "Because," Holmes continued, "someone desired possession of it." The inspector frowned. "You believe the murderer removed it?" I think that's exceedingly likely. Holmes spoke more rapidly now. Suppose Curwen carried the note to the appointed meeting. Suppose the meeting ended violently. The assailant, realizing the paper implicated him, snatched it away, but overlooked the fragment still clutched between the dead man's fingers. The young officer considered this. That seems possible, more than possible. But where is the remainder now? Asked Hayter. Holmes shrugged. In a pocket, perhaps. Destroyed, perhaps. Hidden, perhaps. Yet, wherever it lies, it is central to the case. He fell briefly silent. Then, there is another question. How did Curwen receive the message? The inspector brightened. That I discovered. Holmes smiled approvingly. You have been industrious. I spoke to the postman. Curwen received a letter yesterday afternoon. The envelope, unfortunately, was destroyed. Holmes clapped him warmly upon the shoulder. Excellent, Inspector. Very excellent indeed. I confess the young man glowed beneath such praise. It is a pleasure to work with one who observes. We had now reached the lodge where poor Curwen had lived. Beyond it stretched the avenue leading toward the main house. Cunningham Hall possessed that curious mixture of elegance and severity found in old English country houses. Tall windows overlooked carefully maintained grounds, while ancient oaks stood sentinel about the lawns. Near the kitchen entrance, a constable awaited us. Holmes immediately assumed command. "Open the door, officer." The man obeyed. Holmes surveyed the surroundings with minute attention. "Now then," said he, gesturing toward the staircase, visible through the entrance. Young Miss Cunningham stood there, according to his account. Papier. He pointed toward an upstairs window. And the elder gentleman watched from there. The inspector confirmed it. Holmes moved across the gardens and slowly. The fugitive staked toward that hedge. Yes, and young Cunningham remained beside the wounded servant. Exactly. Holmes crouched near the ground. The soil, hardened by recent dry weather, showed little. "No footprints," he murmured. "The ground is too firm," said Forrester. "Quite so." At that moment, voices approached. Two gentlemen emerged around the side of the house. The elder I recognized immediately as Miss Cunningham, a powerfully built man whose lined face and heavy eyes suggested both authority and stubbornness. Beside him came his son. Alec Cunningham was strikingly handsome, fashionable, and confident. Yet there was something in his quick smile and bright expression which I instinctively disliked. "Still working at it?" said the younger man cheerfully. Holmes bowed slightly. "We do our best." "I thought London detectives never hesitated," Alec continued with an amused smile. "You do not seem particularly swift." Holmes accepted the remark with perfect good humour. "One must allow even London a little time." "You will require it," said Alec. His tone was light. Yet, as I watched him, I fancied I detected beneath the amusement a certain nervous sharpness. Holmes merely smiled. "There is at least one clue," said the inspector. He had scarcely begun speaking when I witnessed a most alarming transformation. Holmes's face suddenly twisted. His eyes rolled upward. A strangled sound escaped him. Then, before any of us could move, he collapsed heavily to the ground. For one dreadful instant, I believed his illness had returned with fatal violence. For a dreadful instant, all conversation ceased. Sherlock Holmes lay motionless upon the ground, his face become pale and strained, his limbs rigid, and his breathing irregular. The suddenness of the collapse startled even me, though I knew well the fragility that still lingered after his recent illness. "Good heavens!" cried Inspector Forrester. Colonel Hayter and I sprang forward together. The two Cunninghams also hurried toward him. Young Alec knelt immediately beside us. "Has he fallen ill?" he asked. "I fear so," said I. My medical instincts took command at once. We lifted Holmes carefully and carried him into the kitchen, where he was settled into a large chair near the window. For several anxious minutes he breathed heavily without speaking. The household servants gathered nervously near the doorway, whispering among themselves. For all Mr. Cunningham watched the troubled and rather suspicious expression. At last Holmes stirred. He pressed a hand against his brow and looked around with evident embarrassment. "I fear," said he weakly, "that I have made rather a spectacle of myself." "You are in no condition for exertion," I said firmly. He offered me an apologetic smile. "Watson continually reminds me of the fact." Mr. Cunningham stepped forward. "You have been seriously ill, then?" "Only recently recovering," Holmes replied. "I am occasionally subject to these unfortunate nervous attacks." The elder Cunningham appeared relieved. "Would you prefer to return to Colonel Hayter's house?" he asked. "I shall gladly send you back in my carriage." Holmes shook his head. No. Since I am already here, there remains one small point upon which I should like satisfaction." The younger Cunningham exchanged a glance with his father. "And what point is that?" Holmes sat forward. "It concerns the sequence of events." The room grew attentive. "As I understand matters," said he, "you believe the burglar had not yet entered the house when William Kirwan confronted him." "Certainly," said old Cunningham. "But might it not be possible," Holmes continued mildly, "that the man had already entered?" The younger Cunningham laughed. "Surely not. Why impossible?" "Because," Alec replied, "the place would have shown signs of disturbance." Holmes folded his hands. "That depends upon what precisely he sought." The elder Cunningham spoke gravely. "My son remained awake in his dressing-room. Had anyone moved through the house, he must have heard it." "Indeed," said Holmes. His tone remained pleasant, almost idle. "And where exactly were you seated, Mr. Alec?" "In my dressing-room. Would you kindly indicate the window?" Alec pointed upward. "The last window to the left, and both lamps were lit." "Of course." Holmes looked up toward the house. "How singular!" The younger man raised an eyebrow. "Singular?" "Yes." Holmes smiled faintly. "That an experienced burglar should choose to break into a house while two windows clearly announced that its occupants remained awake." Alec shrugged. "Then he must have been a bold fellow." "Or a reckless one," said Holmes. The young man's smile sharpened. "Well, Mr. Holmes, had the affair been straightforward, we should hardly require your assistance." His tone remained polite, yet I detected beneath it something faintly mocking. Holmes appeared entirely untroubled. "We must consider every possibility," the elder Cunningham sighed. "You are welcome to inspect whatever you please." Holmes bowed. You are most obliging." He rose, apparently recovered from his attack, though I noticed a faint unsteadiness still lingering in his movements. Before entering the house, however, he paused beside the damaged kitchen door. The lock had been forced inward with considerable violence. Holmes bent close. A chisel, or perhaps a stout knife, had clearly been used. The splintered wood still bore visible scars. "You do not use bars?" he asked. "Never found them necessary," said Cunningham. "And no watchdog. There is one, though chained at the far side of the house." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "When do the servants retire?" "About 10. And Conan himself?" "At much the same hour." Holmes straightened slowly. Curious. Again that word. I had heard it several times already. Whenever Holmes repeated such a term, I knew some chain of reasoning was tightening within his mind. "It is certainly unusual," he continued, "that on this particular evening William should remain awake." No one answered. We entered the house. A stone passage led inward from the kitchen, cool and dim after the brightness outside. The flooring echoed softly beneath our steps. A staircase rose directly from the corridor toward the upper landing. Holmes advanced slowly, examining everything with quiet but unmistakable attention. Though outwardly casual, he missed nothing. His eyes moved from wall to stair, from banister to doorway. I had witnessed that method countless times. He saw, and while the rest of us merely observed, Holmes interpreted. The landing above opened toward several rooms. The elder Cunningham gestured. "My room lies at the end," said he. "My son's is beyond." Holmes glanced upward. "Pray allow me." We climbed together. I noticed Alec Cunningham watching Holmes with increasing scrutiny. His earlier confidence seemed less easy now. "My good sir," said the elder man with some impatience, "surely this examination is unnecessary." "That remains to be seen," Holmes answered pleasantly. He crossed first toward Alec Cunningham's room. "This is yours." "Yes." Holmes entered. The chamber was fashionable and comfortably furnished, revealing its owner's taste for elegance. Beyond it lay the dressing-room, where Alec claimed to have sat smoking when the alarm sounded. Holmes opened the connecting door. "And from here," said he, glancing outward, "you observed the struggle?" "Exactly." He surveyed the view without comment. Then, after several moments, he nodded. "Very good." The elder Cunningham folded his arms. "I trust you are satisfied?" "Almost." Holmes smiled. "If you would permit us one final glance at your own room." The old gentleman gave a weary shrug and led the way. As we entered, I could not possibly have guessed that Holmes stood only moments away from a revelation, or that his strange behavior was about to become stranger still. Mr. Cunningham's chamber was plain, substantial. It lacked the younger man's fashionable touches, and instead reflected the habits of an older country gentleman. Solid furniture, dark curtains, and an atmosphere of practical comfort rather than elegance. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows and fell across the carpet. Near the foot of the bed stood a small table upon which rested a carafe of water and a shallow dish filled with oranges. Holmes entered quietly. At first glance, he seemed merely to be fulfilling the final formality of his inspection. Yet I had learned never to trust appearances where Sherlock Holmes was concerned. He moved slowly across the room. The elder Cunningham watched, with visible impatience. "This," said he, "is surely the last of your inquiries." "If it is not too troublesome," Holmes answered pleasantly. The old gentleman gave a restrained bow. Holmes approached the window. He examined the angle of view, leaning slightly to look across the grounds below. Behind us stood Inspector Forrester, Colonel Hayter, the two Cunninghams, and myself. There seemed nothing remarkable to see. And then, to my utter astonishment, Holmes performed an act so absurd that for an instant I doubted my own senses. As we passed near the table, he suddenly leaned across in front of me and struck it sharply. The crash shattered the stillness of the room. The carafe toppled. Glass exploded across the carpet. Water spread in every direction, while oranges rolled wildly beneath chairs and furniture. I stared. So did everyone else. "You have done it now, Watson," said Holmes calmly. For a moment I could scarcely believe my ears. "Fine mess you have made." The accusation was so unexpected, and delivered with such composure, that I stood utterly speechless. Then, almost instinctively, I understood. There was purpose here. What purpose? I could not imagine, but purpose nonetheless. "My apologies," said I awkwardly, accepting the blame. The Colonel bent to help. Inspector Forrester knelt beside me. Even the elder Cunningham stooped with evident annoyance, while oranges rolled towards every corner of the chamber. The interruption lasted perhaps half a minute, no more. Yet, when at last we restored the table upright and gathered the scattered fruit, the spectre suddenly looked about in surprise. "Hello," he said. "Where has he gone?" Holmes had vanished. The younger Cunningham straightened immediately. "What the devil?" His father frowned. "Where is Mr. Holmes?" No one knew. Young Alec's expression darkened. "The man is unwell," said he sharply. "I believe he is scarcely responsible for his actions. Come, father." Without another word, the pair hurried from the room. For several seconds we remained bewildered. I confess my own feelings were divided between irritation and concern. Holmes's behavior had grown increasingly eccentric throughout the morning, and though I trusted him deeply, memories of his recent collapse in France remained painfully vivid. Inspector Forrester shook his head. "With respect, Doctor," said he quietly, "I begin to think Mr. Holmes may indeed be overtaxing himself." I smiled faintly. "You have not yet seen him at his strangest." The young officer gave a doubtful grunt. "Perhaps not." Then suddenly a cry rang through the house. It came sharp and tactful through the corridor. "Help!" The voice was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. "Help! Murder!" Holmes. Without hesitation, I rushed toward the doorway. The others followed close behind. The cry came again, hoarse now, and struggling. The sound led us along the landing, and into the room we had first examined, Alec Cunningham's bedroom. Beyond it lay the dressing-room, and there, the sight that met us remains fixed forever in my memory. Sherlock Holmes lay half prostrate upon the floor. The two Cunninghams bent over him. Young Alec gripped Holmes violently by the throat with both hands, his handsome face transformed into something savage and unrecognizable. His father clutched Holmes's wrist, twisting fiercely in an attempt to force something from his grasp. For a frozen instant, The scene appeared unreal. Then instinct overcame astonishment. Hayter, Forrester, and I flung ourselves forward together. "Stand back!" I shouted. The struggle ended almost instantly beneath our combined force. Alec Cunningham resisted fiercely, his expression no longer amused or confident, but wild with desperation. We tore him away. Holmes staggered upright. He was deathly pale. One hand pressed against his throat, and his breathing came hard and uneven. Yet his eyes blazed with fierce triumph. "Arrest these men, Inspector," he gasped. The room fell silent. Forrester stared. "Rest!" Holmes steadied himself against the wall. "For the murder of William Kerwin." The words struck us like a thunderclap. For several seconds no one moved. Inspector Forrester looked utterly bewildered. "Oh, come now, Mr. Holmes, surely—" "Tut, man," Holmes snapped. "Look at their faces, and indeed, I shall never forget those faces." The elder Cunningham stood rigid, heavy features drained of colour, and burdened by a dreadful, defeated expression. But it was the son who revealed everything. Gone entirely was the easy smile. Gone the fashionable indifference. In its place glad the naked ferocity of a trapped animal. His eyes burned with hatred. His breathing came fast. He looked not shocked, but cornered. The inspector needed no further persuasion. Without a word, he stepped toward the door and blew sharply upon his whistle. The shrill sound echoed through the house. Footsteps thundered below. 2 constables arrived almost immediately. "I have no choice, gentlemen," said Forrester grimly. Then, with astonishing speed, Alec Cunningham made his move. His hand darted toward his pocket. I saw the flash of metal, a revolver, but Holmes, despite his exhaustion, reacted first. "Drop it." The inspector struck the weapon aside. It clattered harmlessly on his floor. Holmes placed his foot calmly upon it. "Keep that," said he quietly. "It may prove useful at trial." Then he lifted his hand. Between his fingers lay a crumpled fragment of paper. "The remainder," cried the inspector. "Precisely," said Holmes. "And at last I understood. The vanished paper, the mysterious disappearance, the broken table, the strange fit. All had been leading toward this single moment. Yet how Holmes had reached such certainty remained utterly beyond me. For several moments after the arrests, the dressing-room remained heavy with confusion and disbelief. The constables stood guard beside the 2 prisoners. Young Alec Cunningham still struggled against restraint, his dark eyes burning with violent fury, while his father appeared suddenly aged beyond his years, silent, stunned, and defeated. Holmes, meanwhile, had recovered his composure with astonishing speed, though his collar hung disordered, and faint marks already darkened his throat. His expression carried that familiar air of cool satisfaction which always appeared when the final pieces of a mystery had fallen into place. Inspector Forrester looked from the prisoners to Holmes and back again. "The remainder of the note," he said. Holmes nodded, the very object for which I returned to the room. The inspectors stared. "And it was hidden here?" "Exactly where I expected." The young officer shook his head in amazement. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I do not yet understand a single step of this affair." Holmes smiled faintly. "You soon shall." The elder Cunningham at last found his voice. "This is outrageous," he muttered hoarsely, but the protest lacked conviction. Indeed, guilt already hung so plainly about both men that denial sounded almost pitiful. Inspector Forrester addressed them firmly. "I regret the necessity, Mr. Cunningham, but circumstances leave me no alternative." At this, young Alex suddenly twisted violently toward us. "You fools!" he shouted. His handsome face had become distorted with rage. "You have nothing that can—" He stopped abruptly, for Holmes had unfolded the recovered paper. The younger man saw it, and in that instant, whatever resistance remained seemed to collapse within him. I shall never forget the transformation, the ferocity drained away. In its place appeared something colder, despair. Holmes slipped the paper carefully into his pocket. "I think," said he quietly, "that discussion may be reserved for later." The inspector nodded to his men. The prisoners were removed. Their footsteps echoed along the passage and faded down the staircase. Only after the house had grown quiet again did I allow myself to breathe freely. The violence of the encounter had shaken me more than I cared to admit. Holmes adjusted his collar with a slight wince. "My dear fellow," I exclaimed, "are you injured? Nothing serious, Watson. You might have been murdered. That possibility certainly presented itself." He spoke with maddening calm. Colonel Hayter stared at him. "But what in heaven's name possessed you to face them alone?" Holmes gave a small smile. "My dear Colonel, I had no wish to face them alone. I merely wished to secure the paper before they destroyed it." Inspector Forrester looked thoroughly bewildered. "But why disappear? Why overturn the table? Why all this mystery?" Holmes glanced toward the window. "Because direct methods would have failed." He seemed suddenly weary. "The matter, however, requires fuller explanation that can conveniently be given here." He turned to Hayter. "If you and Watson would kindly return to your house, I shall rejoin you shortly. The inspector and I must first conclude certain formalities." The colonel hesitated. "You are certain you are fit?" "Quite. Though I was reluctant to leave him. I knew resistance would prove useless." Thus Hayter and I returned to his residence, while Holmes remained behind with the authorities. The walk back seemed unusually quiet. The peaceful Surrey lanes through which we passed appeared strangely at odds with the violence we had just witnessed. Hayter at last broke the silence. "Upon my word, Watson, I am completely at sea." "You are not alone," I admitted. "I never saw guilt written more plainly than upon those faces." "Nor I." But how Holmes reached his conclusion? The colonel shook his head. "I confess myself defeated," I smiled. "So am I, and yet, beneath my bewilderment, there stirred a familiar feeling, confidence. Experience had taught me that when Holmes acted strangely, reason almost always lay hidden beneath the appearance of absurdity. Still, even by his own standards, today's conduct had been extraordinary. The false illness, the smashed table, the sudden disappearance, the reckless venture into the dressing-room. I could connect none of it. We found luncheon awaiting us in Hayter's smoking room. The Colonel ordered brandy brought, and we settled into uneasy conversation while awaiting Holmes's return. At length, shortly after 1 o'clock, footsteps sounded outside. The door opened. Sherlock Holmes entered. He appeared somewhat fatigued, but otherwise composed. With him came a small elderly gentleman, whom I recognized immediately from the Colonel's earlier account. Holmes performed the introduction. Mr. Acton, the old gentleman, bowed. He possessed keen features and an expression of lively intelligence. "I wished Mr. Acton present," Holmes explained, "as certain aspects of this affair concern him very directly." Hayter motioned them toward chairs. "My dear Holmes," said he warmly, "I must first congratulate you, though I confess frankly that I have not the faintest understanding of what occurred." Mr. Acton nodded vigorously. "Nor I." Holmes laughed softly and accepted a glass of brandy. "I fear," said he, settling himself comfortably, "that my explanation may somewhat diminish the glamour of the business." "I doubt it," said Hayter. Holmes raised the glass. "The struggle in the dressing-room has left me rather shaken. My strength remains imperfect." "You suffered no second attack?" I asked. At this Holmes looked toward me with unmistakable amusement. "Tack?" His eyes twinkled. Evident to my astonishment, he burst into hearty laughter. "We shall come to that presently." I stared. The Colonel looked equally puzzled. Holmes leaned back in his chair. "It has always been my habit," said he, "to conceal neither methods nor reasoning from those capable of appreciating them. And since you gentlemen have been kind enough to accompany me through this singular business, you shall hear precisely how the truth emerged." He placed his fingertips together. Outside, soft spring light rested upon the Surrey lawns. Inside, the room grew quiet, and thus Sherlock Holmes prepared to unravel, step by careful step, the strange and deadly mystery of the Reigate Puzzle. Holmes settled deeper into the Colonel's chair and held his glass of brandy toward the firelight. The room had grown pleasantly quiet. Outside, the Surrey afternoon drifted softly over the lawns and trees, while within the smoking-room, the atmosphere seemed charged with anticipation. I had often witnessed Holmes explain his deductions, yet the fascination never diminished. Indeed, I sometimes think that those quiet moments after danger had passed possessed a charm greater than the excitement itself. Colonel Hayter leaned forward eagerly. "My dear Holmes," said he, "I confess complete defeat. I have not seen even the shadow of a clue." Holmes smiled. "That, my dear Colonel, is perhaps because one must first decide which facts matter and which merely distract." Mr. Acton nodded with interest. Holmes continued. "In detection, energy is often wasted upon details that possess no real significance. The essential art lies in distinguishing between what is incidental, retelling." He placed his glass aside. "In this affair, the vital point presented itself from the very beginning." "The paper?" I asked. "Exactly, Watson." Holmes drew the torn fragment from his pocket and laid it upon the table. "I became convinced almost immediately that the key to the entire case lay within this scrap found in William Kirwan's hand." Inspector Forrester, who had accompanied Holmes back to the Colonel's house, sat listening with intense attention. "You suspected the Cunninghams from the start?" he asked. "Not entirely," Holmes replied, "but they entered my calculations very early. He folded his hands. Consider first the younger Cunningham's narrative. According to him, the murderer fired and instantly fled. That was his statement, said the inspector. Quite so. But if the killer fled immediately, then he could not have torn the paper from Kirwan's grasp. The inspector blinked. A moment later, understanding dawned. Because the Tegman still held the fragment. Precisely. Holmes nodded. Someone removed the remainder afterward. The colonel sat upright, and that person could scarcely have been anyone except Alec Cunningham himself. A thoughtful silence followed. Holmes continued gently. You see how easily assumptions mislead us. Inspector Forrester, quite naturally, began with the belief that these respectable country gentlemen stood above suspicion. The young officer coloured faintly. I suppose I did. A common and understandable tendency. But I make it a rule never to permit social standing to interfere with observation. Holmes lifted the scrap once more. Now we come to the document itself. He held it toward us. At first glance it appears insignificant. Mr. Acton peered closely. Fragment only. Yes, but a highly instructive fragment. Holmes's eyes brightened. Observe the writing. We examined it. I confess I noticed little beyond uneven lettering. Holmes smiled at my expression. My dear Watson, you disappoint me. I always do when handwriting is involved. He laughed softly. There can be no doubt whatsoever that two separate persons composed this message. Hayter looked astonished. Two? Indeed. Holmes pointed toward the words. Notice the contrast between the firm, strongly crossed letters and the weaker hand beside them. Compare the at and 2 with quarter and 12. The colonel bent nearer. By heaven, he murmured, I believe you're right. The words alternate, Holmes continued. One man wrote part of the message, leaving spaces which the other filled. Inspector Forrester stared. But why? A precaution. Holmes spoke quietly. The business concerned them both. Neither entirely trusted the other. Each therefore insisted upon sharing responsibility for the note. Acton gave an exclamation. Remarkable. More than remarkable, said Holmes. Highly revealing. He continued. The stronger writer clearly directed matters. Observe how the spaces left for the second writer prove imperfect. The word quarter is cramped awkwardly between others already written. This tells us the first hand composed its portion beforehand. The leader, said Hayter. Exactly. Holmes leaned back. But handwriting reveals more than authority. His voice softened slightly, taking on that lecture-like tone which always appeared when he discussed subjects he particularly enjoyed. One may often estimate age from penmanship with surprising accuracy. I smiled. One of your darker sciences. A useful one. He tapped the fragment. One hand belonged to a younger man, firm, bold, vigorous. The other showed signs of advancing age, still legible, certainly, but weakened. Mr. Acton nodded slowly. Father and son. Holmes's smile broadened. You anticipate me. The room grew still, for there exists something else, something subtler. He pointed again. These two writers are related. The colonel stared. Related? Blood relations. I looked up. From handwriting alone. In parts. Holmes's eyes gleamed. There are family characteristics in script, just as surely as in features. Certain forms repeat themselves unconsciously across generations. He indicated several letters, the Greek-shaped ears, the tails of particular characters, small but telling similarities. Acton gave an enthusiastic nod. Excellent. Holmes waved the compliment aside. I mention only the principal conclusions. Many lesser indications supported the same impression. By the time I finished studying the paper, I entertained little doubt. The father and son Cunningham had together written the note. Inspector Forrester sat silent. I confess I felt the same quiet astonishment which Holmes's deductions so often produced. To him, a scrap of paper became testimony, a handwriting sample became character, and what seemed meaningless to ordinary eyes emerged under his analysis as something almost alive. But suspicion alone was insufficient, Holmes continued. I next turned to the physical evidence. He looked toward the window thoughtfully. And there, gentlemen, the Cunninghams made several grave mistakes. He paused. I knew that tone. The true heart of the mystery was approaching, and in the peaceful smoking room, while afternoon sunlight drifted softly through the glass, we listened as Sherlock Holmes prepared to reveal how simple observation had transformed suspicion into certainty. Holmes sat quietly for a moment after speaking, allowing the significance of his deductions to settle over us. The Colonel had forgotten his cigar entirely. Miss Acton leaned forward with keen attention. Even Inspector Forrester, who had thus far followed the explanation with alternating admiration and disbelief, now listened with absolute concentration. Holmes folded his long fingers together. Having formed my opinion regarding the authorship of the note, said he, I turned next to the scene itself. He glanced toward the window. A theory, however promising, remains worthless unless supported by facts. The inspector nodded, and the facts agreed most emphatically. Holmes rose and paced slowly toward the mantel. First, said he, I examined the wound suffered by William Kirwan. He spoke with calm precision. The revolver had been discharged from a distance exceeding 4 yards. I looked up. You are certain? Entirely. There were no powder marks. None. Holmes inclined his head, and that single observation immediately contradicted Alec Cunningham's account. The Colonel frowned. He claimed the two men were wrestling when the shot was fired. Exactly. Holmes stopped pacing. But had they been grappling, powder blackening must inevitably have appeared upon the clothing. Inspector Forrester muttered softly. Then the struggle never happened. Not as described. Holmes spoke without triumph. The statement was false. A thoughtful silence followed. I remembered vividly the confident manner with which Alec Cunningham described the scene, his certainty, his easy composure. How deceptive appearances could be. Holmes continued. Then came a second difficulty. He looked toward us. Both father and son agreed precisely upon the direction of the supposed murderer's escape. The hedge, said Hayter, and the road beyond. Holmes nodded. Precisely. He resumed pacing. Now, as fortune would have it, the ground at that particular point contains a broad ditch. I recalled it immediately. A shallow depression lying near the hedge. It had been moist at the bottom, Holmes said. Recent dampness remained there. The inspector frowned. Yes, and yet, Holmes continued softly, not a trace of footprints existed. Forrester stared. The truth dawned slowly across his face. No marks at all. None whatsoever. Holmes's voice remained quiet. A man fleeing hurriedly across such ground must leave signs behind him. The colonel struck his knee. Then there never was an escaping burglar. Holmes smiled faintly. That became my conclusion. Mr. Acton stared in astonishment. Then the entire story was manufactured. Holmes resumed his seat. The Cunninghams lied not once, but repeatedly. Inspector Forrester shook his head in disbelief, and I accepted it all, quite naturally, said Holmes kindly. You possessed no reason initially to suspect otherwise. He took a sip of brandy. The question then became motive. Outside, I noticed the afternoon light beginning to soften. The room itself seemed wrapped in calm, though the tale Holmes unfolded contained murder and deceit. As I considered the matter, said he, my thoughts returned to Mr. Acton's burglary. The elderly gentleman straightened. My house? Yes. Holmes turned toward him. Colonel Hayter had informed me of the lawsuit between yourself and the Cunninghams. Acton nodded grimly. A most exhausting affair. Indeed. And immediately I wondered whether the burglary possessed a more specific purpose than ordinary theft. Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. Suppose, gentlemen, that certain documents connected with the dispute existed within Mr. Acton's library. The old man gave a short laugh. You are perfectly correct. Hayter looked surprised. You mean they were searching for papers? There can be no doubt, said Acton. Their legal position is vulnerable. Had they discovered particular documents, it might have seriously damaged my claim. Holmes inclined his head. There, you see, lies the explanation. He continued carefully. The burglary was never ordinary theft. The inspector sat motionless. The thieves, father and son Cunningham, enter Acton's library searching for legal papers, and when they failed, I asked, they improvised. Holmes smiled faintly. To disguise their true purpose, they carried away miscellaneous objects, a volume, candlesticks, string, and other absurdities. The colonel laughed softly. So the bizarre collection finally makes sense. Entirely. Holmes settled back. At that stage much remained uncertain. Yet I now possessed 3 essential conclusions. He counted upon his fingers. First, the note connected directly to the crime. Second, the Cunninghams had written it. Third, the supposed burglar never existed. Inspector Forrester exhaled slowly. That alone seems enough to hang them. Almost, Holmes said, but not quite. He paused. For suspicion, however powerful, is not proof. The room fell silent again. I knew what came next. The recovered paper, the false seizure, the smashed table. Holmes looked toward me with unmistakable amusement. And thus, said he, I found myself confronted by a practical problem. The missing note, I said. Precisely, Watson. He removed the recovered sheet from his pocket. I was certain Alec Cunningham had torn it from Kerwin's hand. A handy Almost certainly in the pocket of his dressing gown. Hayter leaned forward. But how could you know that? Simple probability. Holmes turned the paper thoughtfully. He had little opportunity to conceal it elsewhere. The question was not where he placed it, but whether it remained there. Inspector Forrester smiled ruefully. And you meant to find out? Holmes laughed softly. Exactly. Now his eyes shone with that familiar mischievous light. And for that purpose, said he, certain theatrics became necessary. The Colonel burst into laughter. Ah, at last we arrive at your mysterious illness. Holmes inclined his head. I have feared, gentlemen, that your sympathy was somewhat misplaced. I stared at him. You mean my collapse, said Holmes, smiling broadly, was entirely deliberate. I could not help laughing. Holmes, my apologies, Watson. The Colonel shook with amusement. So your nervous attack was an invention, a professional device. Holmes's eyes twinkled. It served admirably. And thus, with growing astonishment, and no small irritation, at having been deceived so thoroughly, we prepared to hear how Holmes's extraordinary performance had led directly to the destruction of the Cunninghams. Holmes settled comfortably back into his chair, and though laughter still lingered in his eyes, his voice remained calm and measured. My collapse, said he, served two purposes. Colonel Hayter shook his head in disbelief. I confess myself entirely deceived. So was I admitted. Holmes smiled towards me. My apologies, Watson. I knew your concern would be genuine, which unfortunately made the performance more convincing. You might have warned me. That would have spoiled it. The Colonel laughed. And the purpose? Holmes folded his hands. The first was simple. Inspector Forrester stood on the verge of discussing the torn paper before the Cunninghams. The inspector nodded slowly. I remember. Had he done so, Holmes continued, they would instantly have understood our suspicions and destroyed the missing portion at the earliest opportunity. So you interrupted matters with your fit, said Hayter. Precisely. Holmes spoke lightly. Conversation changed entirely, and the paper remained unsuspected. I could not help smiling despite myself. Remarkably theatrical. Necessity, Watson. Holmes lifted the recovered note, but interruption alone achieved little. I still needed proof. He turned toward us. Where we entered the house, I watched closely for opportunities. The crucial question concerned the hiding place of the missing fragment. You believed Alec carried it? Yes. Holmes nodded. The dressing gown offered the obvious concealment. Inspector Forrester frowned. But how could you search it while they stood watching? By ensuring they were not watching. The Colonel laughed again. The oranges. Exactly. Holmes's expression grew mildly satisfied. I had already seen the dressing gown hanging behind the door when we inspected the younger Cunningham's rooms. Once inside the father's chamber, all that remained was to distract the company long enough for me to return. And so, I said dryly, I became responsible for wrecking the furniture. My dear fellow, said Holmes, you performed admirably. I shook my head. You are impossible. He laughed softly. The confusion occupied everyone for half a minute. That was sufficient. His face grew thoughtful. I slipped back along the corridor, entered Alec Cunningham's dressing room, and examined pockets. And found it? Asked Mr. Acton eagerly. Exactly where expected. Holmes tapped the folded sheet, but scarcely had I secured the paper, and my movements were discovered. I remembered again the dreadful sight of the struggle. The Cunninghams attacked you. With commendable energy, Holmes rubbed his wrist lightly. The elder gentleman attempted to twist the evidence from my grasp, while his son adopted more direct methods. His fingers touched the faint marks upon his throat. I confess, Alec possessed an unpleasantly powerful grip. The colonel shuddered. They would have killed you, very probably. Holmes spoke without drama. The sudden transition from security to exposure made them desperate. Inspector Forrester nodded grimly. That explains the revolver. Indeed. Holmes placed the recovered paper carefully upon the table. Afterward I spoke privately with the elder Cunningham. Had he confessed? I asked. Holmes inclined his head. Completely. The room fell quiet. Outside, evening shadows began to gather softly across the gardens. The peaceful countryside seemed curiously distant from the crime Holmes now described. It appears, said he, that William Kirwan had secretly followed his employers on the night of the burglary at Mr. Acton's house. Mr. Acton frowned. So he witnessed everything. Precisely, Holmes continued. Having discovered their guilt, Kirwan made the dangerous mistake of believing he could profit from it. Blackmail, said Hayter quietly. Yes, Holmes's expression remained grave. He threatened exposure. The colonel sighed. A dangerous game, particularly with Alec Cunningham. Holmes looked thoughtfully into the fire. It was the younger man who conceived the murder. The room remained silent. The burglary scare throughout the district suggested an opportunity. A second supposed burglary would attract little surprise. Kirwan could be summoned under false pretenses and disposed of, while blame fell conveniently upon some imaginary intruder. He touched the paper. The note served as bait. And Annie Morrison? I asked. Holmes nodded. A name inserted merely to strengthen the deception. Whether genuine affection or acquaintance existed, we do not know. He unfolded the recovered message fully and laid it before us. Slowly, Holmes read aloud. If you will only come around at 11:45 to the East Gate, you will learn what will very much surprise you, and may be of the greatest service to you, and also to Annie Morrison. But say nothing to anyone upon the matter. The words settled softly into silence. Even now, I could imagine poor Kirwan receiving such a message, curious, hopeful perhaps, entirely unaware that he walked toward death. Holmes folded the paper once more. The trap, said he quietly, was skilfully baited. Mr. Acton shook his head, and had the fragment been fully removed, Holmes nodded. Suspicion might never have awakened. The inspector sighed heavily. A remarkable case, one of many reminders, said Holmes, that crime often fails not through lack of planning, but through neglect of small details. He looked toward the fire. The missing scrap, the false struggle, the absent footprints. I smiled. And the handwriting. His eyes brightened. Ah, yes, the handwriting. Even now, despite the grimness of the affair, Holmes seemed unable to resist that scholarly pleasure. "The hereditary characteristics interested me greatly," said he. "Particularly the loops and crossings." Hayter laughed. "You solve murders from penmanship, while the rest of us struggle merely to read our own letters." Holmes smiled. "Observation, my dear Colonel. Nothing more." The room gradually relaxed. The danger had passed. Justice, for once, had arrived swiftly. At length, Holmes rose and moved toward the window. The last of the afternoon light lingered over the Surrey fields. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, "I think our country race has proved highly successful." I joined him there. "You call this rest?" He smiled. I returned to Baker Street considerably restored, and so ended the strange affair of Reigate Puzzle. Though blood had been spilled beneath quiet English skies, I remember the case less for violence than for that peaceful Surrey spring, and for the curious spectacle of Sherlock Holmes recovering his health by pursuing yet another mystery. The countryside grew dark, the fire burned low, and before long Holmes and I would return once more to Baker Street, where fresh adventures already waited in the London fog.